He must have got in somehow, my mother said in a fearful whisper. I opened the kitchen door very gradually. He's got his hand in the letter box, I whispered over my shoulder to the others. In the middle of the front door, there was a wide slot through which the postman pushed letters and papers so that they fell inside on the hall floor. On the outside, the slot was protected by a brass flap, and the old man had lifted this and was trying to peer into the hall. We knew very well that the slot gave him only a limited and indistinct view of the hall, but we were unreasonably startled to realize that he had found an opening in the house. Suddenly, he began to shout through the slot. He's roaring mad, Terry whispered. He'll kill us all. Can you make out what he's saying? Asked my mother, who was appalled. He's saying, apple, 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 I said. Terry and I collapsed into hysterical mirth. My mother bundled us out into the garden and came out herself. Have you no heart? She said. To laugh at an unfortunate man who probably never gets enough to eat? Now we're really not in, I said, because we're in the garden. Derry joined me in screeches of laughter. If I thought he could hear you, my mother said fiercely to us, I'd murder you both. Well, it's too late to answer the door now, she added. I couldn't face him after this. I'll make it up to him next week. There was sudden silence. No knocking, no shouting. He's gone away, my mother said in a tone of guilty relief. At that moment, the tousled head and avid eyes of the woman next door appeared over the wall that separated our garden from hers. Mrs. Brennan, she shouted. She had a powerful voice. There's an old fellow outside with apples for you. He says he's been at your door for half an hour. He says he comes regularly, and he knows you're depending on him. I told him you were in the garden. He must be back around at your door by now. There he is. There he was. The knocking had started again. Oh, God, forgive me, my mother cried. That old villain. He must have known I was hiding from him. What are you hiding for? Our neighbor said. Our neighbor shrieked. Do you owe him? Oh, no, my mother said indignantly. But I don't want any apples. Well, why don't you just tell him to go about his business? I will, of course. That's what I'm going to do. Just give him a piece of your mind for making a nuisance of himself and shut the door in his face, commanded our neighbor with relish. My mother went into our kitchen, took her purse in her hand, and marched to the door, with Derry and me following. The old man was a pitiful sight. He had forgotten to take off his hat, and his eyes glittered. Whether with anguish or with anger, it would have been hard to say. He pushed the 2 bags of apples rudely into my mother's arms without looking at her. She opened her purse to pay him and gave a cry of distress. Didn't I go pay the grocer only an hour ago? And I'm 4 pence short. She handed him the money and showed him that it left her purse empty. It's all I have in the house at the minute, she said. He grabbed the money, counted it, and gave her back a dreadful look of contempt. Then he lifted his enormous basket, which was, as always, full to the brim, and turned his back on us. This time we all stood in the front sitting room window and watched him. He didn't close our gate, and he scuttled off. He scuttled slowly off down the street, as though he couldn't get away from us fast enough. First he thought we were making fun of him, my mother said, and now he thinks I was trying to bargain with him? He might have known I'd make it up to him the next time. She, who never tried to bargain with anybody in her life, was filled with shame. Next week we'll have the door open for him before he knocks, I said. But the following week there was no sign of the old man, and he never came near us again. Although filled with remorse, we watched for him. One afternoon my Uncle Matt dropped around to see us, and my mother, in a confiding mood, told him the whole story. Well, I could have told you, he said, grinning. It wasn't so much the apples, my mother said. Oh, no, said my uncle. You'd have liked him to come by your door and ask straight out for money, like the rest of your beggars. My mother was noted for her inability to refuse food, clothes, or money to anybody who came to the door. How many times must I tell you not to call them beggars? She said angrily now to my uncle. They're just unfortunate, and I wouldn't be so quick to laugh at them if I were you. Well, you're rid of him, my uncle said, and I may as well tell you now that I saw him strolling down O'Connell Street the other morning, wearing a suit of clothes that I couldn't afford to buy, and not an apple in sight. There's your poor old man for you. Now, how did you know it was him? My mother cried skeptically. You never saw him at all. Wasn't I here the first time he came to the door? I was standing in the middle of the kitchen, and you had the hall door wide open. Of course I saw him. Well, you're making all that up about seeing him on O'Connell Street. I saw him, and I passed close enough to touch him. He had his married daughter from Drumcondra with him. And how do you know she was his married daughter from Drumcondra, may I ask? Oh, you couldn't mistake her, my uncle said airily. I knew her by the way she was wearing her hat. That tongue of yours, Matt, my mother said. I never know whether to believe you or not. For my part, I believed every word my uncle said.